I came back to visit my wife unexpectedly. She was sleeping on the doormat, wearing torn old clothes. My son-in-law wiped his shoes on her and told the guests that is our crazy maid. I did not scream. I took a step forward, and everyone froze because of what I said next. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. 72 hours ago, I was standing on a freezing logistics dock in Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. For 2 years, I managed supply chains in the sub-zero dark. Every paycheck, every ounce of my overtime went straight into the mortgage of the sprawling brick estate in Stamford, Connecticut. It was for my daughter Melanie and her husband Brent. They needed help. They needed a foundation. I gave them mine, taking a grueling contract thousands of miles away, leaving my wife Patty to enjoy her golden years in the comfort of the home I was bleeding to pay for. I stepped out of the taxi into the crisp Connecticut evening, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I had not told them I was coming. It was a surprise visit for Patty's birthday. I walked up the manicured driveway. Expensive cars lined the street. Porsches, imported sedans, luxury SUVs. Through the massive bay windows, I saw the warm glow of chandeliers and men in tailored suits holding champagne flutes. A lavish party was in full swing. I smiled, thinking Brent's tech startup was finally taking off, meaning my financial sacrifices had paid off. I reached the mahogany front door and slid my brass key into the lock. It did not turn. I jiggled it. The cylinder was entirely different. New locks. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I did not ring the bell. I walked around the perimeter past the manicured hedges to the side service door. I had installed that solid oak frame myself 5 years ago. I knew exactly where the latch stuck. I pressed my shoulder against the wood-applied pressure to the hidden sweet spot and slipped inside. The service hallway was pitch black leading into the mudroom. I moved quietly, the heavy bass of the party music vibrating through the floorboards. I took a step toward the inner door, and my boot caught on something soft. A sharp gasp pierced the dark. I dropped to my knees, my hands blindly searching the floor until my fingers brushed against a thin, trembling shoulder. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The breath violently escaped my lungs. It was Patty. My wife of 45 years was curled up on a stained dog mat. She was wearing a filthy, oversized t-shirt that smelled of damp mold and urine. Her cheekbones protruded sharply. Her hair was matted. She looked up at me, blinking against the light, her eyes cloudy and terrified. She opened her cracked lips, but before she could process my face, the interior door handle rattled. I instantly turned off the light and stepped back into the shadows of the heavy winter coats. The door swung open, spilling golden light into the mudroom. Brent stepped in, leading 2 wealthy-looking men in expensive suits. Brent laughed, a slick, practiced sound, as he turned to his guests. He did not look down. He casually scraped the mud from his Italian loafers directly onto the edge of Patty's thin blanket. She flinched, pulling her knees to her chest. One of the investors frowned, looking down at the frail woman shivering on the floor. Brent waved a dismissive hand. "Do not mind her, gentlemen," he said smoothly. "That is our crazy maid. She has severe dementia, but she works for room and board. It keeps her off the streets." The investors chuckled nervously, turning their attention back to the lucrative pitch. I did not scream. I did not fly into a blind rage. In Alaska, you learn that panic kills you faster than the cold. You survive by turning your blood to ice. I stepped out of the shadows. The sudden movement caught the investors off guard. Brent spun around, the arrogant smile instantly freezing on his face. The color drained from his cheeks until he looked like a corpse. I locked eyes with the 2 investors, my voice a low, terrifying rasp that echoed off the tiled walls. "I apologize for my wife's condition, gentlemen. Her son-in-law forgot to mention she owns the floor he is currently wiping his shoes on." The silence in the mudroom was absolute. The investors stared at Brent in sheer horror, the champagne glasses trembling in their hands. Brent opened his mouth, stammering, trying to salvage his $1 million facade. "Gerald," he choked out, forcing a desperate, panicked laugh. "Gerald, what are you doing here? Let us step outside and I can explain everything." He reached forward, attempting to forcefully grab my arm to usher me out the back door away from his guests. His hand clamped down on my bicep. I did not hesitate. I shifted my weight, grabbing his wrist and twisting it downward with the brutal, precise leverage I used to secure cargo chains. Brent let out a sharp cry of pain, his knees buckling instantly. He dropped to the floor, gasping right beside the mat where my wife lay. I released him and knelt beside Patty. I scooped her into my arms. She weighed almost nothing. It was like holding a fragile bird. She pressed her face against my jacket, her hands gripping my shirt. "He took my phone, Jerry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He took everything." I stood up, holding my wife against my chest. I walked right past the stunned investors and pushed the service door open with my shoulder. Behind me, Brent scrambled to his feet, holding his bruised wrist. "You cannot take her," he shouted from the porch, his voice cracking with desperation. "I have medical power of attorney. You are an estranged intruder. I will call the police and have you arrested for kidnapping." I did not look back. I carried my wife down the driveway, ignoring the luxury cars and the staring faces in the windows, and gently placed her in the back of my waiting taxi. "Drive," I told the driver. "Do not stop until we hit the emergency room at the private hospital downtown." The ride was a blur of streetlights and Patty's shallow breathing. I held her hand, feeling the brittle bones beneath her papery skin. How had I not known? I had called the house every Sunday. Brent or Melanie always answered cheerfully, explaining that Patty was resting or gardening or out with friends. They had built a fortress of lies, and I had funded the bricks. I carried her through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, demanding immediate attention. I registered her under my mother's maiden name, an alias to buy us time. The triage nurses took one look at her emaciated frame and rushed her behind the sterile curtains. I paced the waiting room, my mind meticulously cataloging every detail, every financial transfer, every legal document I had ever signed over to my daughter and her husband. 2 hours later, the attending physician pulled me into a quiet side room. He was a stern man with heavy bags under his eyes. He looked at me with a mixture of professional concern and deep suspicion. "Your wife does not have dementia," the doctor said, his voice flat. "Her cognitive impairment is entirely chemical. She is suffering from severe, prolonged malnutrition. More concerning, we found dangerously high levels of unprescribed sedatives in her bloodstream. Someone has been intentionally keeping her docile and starved." A cold fury settled into my chest. Brent had not just neglected her. He had systematically poisoned her to keep her trapped in that mudroom. He was torturing her to secure his hold on my assets. I was about to ask the doctor for a full toxicology report when a commotion at the front desk interrupted us. I stepped out of the office. 2 police officers in heavy tactical gear were standing at the triage desk, their hands resting on their utility belts. They were showing the nurse a photograph. It was a picture of me. "We have an active Amber Alert," the taller officer said, his voice carrying across the waiting room. "A dangerous, estranged individual just abducted a mentally unfit senior citizen from her legal guardian in Stamford. We have reason to believe she is in immediate danger." The nurse pointed a shaking finger directly at me. The officers turned, their hands dropping to their radios. The resolution of the mudroom trap had instantly birthed a far more dangerous threat. I was no longer just a betrayed father. I was a wanted fugitive standing between my poisoned wife and the man trying to legally bury us both. I stepped between the 2 officers and the curtain hiding my wife. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice came out dangerously quiet. I told them they were not taking her anywhere. The taller officer rested his hand on his radio, his jaw set in a hard line. He warned me to step aside, stating that I was interfering with a medical kidnapping investigation and that the legal guardian had the right to secure his mother-in-law. I did not move. I asked the officer if he had actually read the report Brent filed, or if he just took the word of a man wearing an expensive suit. I demanded they pull the property deed to that house in Stamford. I told them to look at the name on the title. It was not Brent. It was Gerald and Patty. I explained that I was not an estranged intruder. I was the homeowner, and the woman behind that curtain was my wife of 45 years. The second officer frowned, clearly thrown off by my absolute lack of panic. He asked for my identification. I reached into my coat pocket slowly, knowing any sudden movement could end with me in handcuffs. But before my fingers could grasp my wallet, the emergency room doors slid open with a violent hiss. Brent stormed into the waiting area looking every bit the panicked, loving family man, and right behind him was Melanie, my daughter, the little girl I had spent 2 freezing years in Prudhoe Bay trying to support. The girl whose extravagant wedding I had paid for in cash. She was wearing a cashmere coat, I recognized, because I had wired the money for it last Christmas. She did not run to me. She did not push past the officers to ask how her mother was doing. Instead, she stayed firmly behind her husband's shoulder, her eyes darting everywhere except toward my face. Brent immediately pointed at me, his voice pitching into a perfect theatrical tremble. He told the officers that I was the man. He claimed I was the one who broke into their home and dragged a severely ill woman out into the cold. He insisted I was completely unstable and needed to be detained before I hurt her. I ignored Brent entirely. I looked right at my daughter. I called her name, my voice cutting through the sterile hum of the hospital lobby. I told her to look at me. She flinched. She clutched the lapels of her coat, staring intently at the linoleum floor. She whispered that her mom was sick, her voice rehearsed and completely hollow. She told me I did not understand how bad it had gotten. She claimed Patty was violent, that she hallucinated that she attacked the staff. She said Brent had to put her in the mudroom for her own safety because she kept trying to wander into traffic. She pleaded with me not to disrupt the care plan they had set up. The room seemed to tilt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, suddenly blinding in their intensity. She is violent. She attacks the staff. My Patty, a retired school librarian who wept when she accidentally stepped on a garden snail, was being painted as a rabid animal. And my own daughter was the one holding the brush. I stared at Melanie, waiting for a crack in her facade, waiting for a single tear, a sign that she was being coerced or threatened. But there was nothing. I saw only the cold, calculated preservation of her lifestyle. She knew. She knew her mother was sleeping on a dog mat. She knew Brent was poisoning her with unprescribed sedatives. She knew all of it, and she accepted it as the price of admission for her luxury cars and her country club dinners. The betrayal was a physical weight, crushing the last remnants of the father who had boarded a plane to Alaska 2 years ago. That man died right there in the emergency room. The taller officer stepped closer and unhooked his handcuffs. He told me that my daughter was confirming the Guardian's report. He ordered me to turn around and put my hands behind my back, stating they were taking the patient back to her legal residence. I did not raise my hands. Instead, I pulled my wallet from my coat and flipped it open. I did not show them a standard driver's license. I handed them my federal logistics clearance. It was a solid, undeniable piece of government plastic, bearing a Level 4 security classification from the Department of Defense required for managing the frozen supply chains at the absolute edge of the continent. The officer took it, his eyes scanning the holographs and the federal seals. The arrogance on his face faltered. I told him to read the clearance, keeping my voice loud enough for Brent to hear every single syllable. I explained that I managed sovereign supply networks. I underwent deep psychological and financial background checks every 6 months. I told them I was not an estranged, violent intruder. I was a federally vetted contractor, and I was officially declaring that the man standing behind them was chemically restraining my wife to steal my estate. I warned them that if they removed her from this hospital without a court order, I would not just sue their precinct. I would bring the Federal Oversight Board down on their badges by tomorrow morning. The officers exchanged a long, uneasy look. Brent stepped forward, his face flushed with panicked rage. He told them the ID meant nothing, that I was just a glorified truck driver who abandoned his family. He demanded they do their jobs and arrest me right now. But the taller officer handed my ID back. The certainty had vanished from his posture entirely. He looked at Brent, then at me, visibly weighing the very real risk of tangling with a man who carried the government's backing. He finally announced that this was a civil matter, his voice tight with frustration. He stated they were not dragging a sick woman out of a hospital bed tonight, but he pointed a stern finger directly at my chest. He gave me exactly 24 hours. He warned me that if I did not produce a judge's injunction invalidating Brent's medical power of attorney, by this time tomorrow she would go back to the legal guardian. He added that if I tried to move her from the hospital before then, he would arrest me himself. The officers turned and walked out, leaving the threat hanging heavy in the air. Brent sneered, adjusting his tailored cuffs, his confidence returning now that he knew the clock was ticking. He mocked me, asking if I thought a plastic badge changed anything. He laughed at the 24-hour deadline, stating I could not afford a lawyer who could undo a signed proxy in one day. He told me to enjoy my last visit, promising that tomorrow she was coming home with him and I was going back to the ice. He turned on his heel and marched out the sliding glass doors. Melanie followed him, a dutiful shadow, never once looking back to see if I was okay. I stood alone in the hallway, the countdown already echoing in my head. I had one day to dismantle an entire empire of lies. I walked back into Patty's room, pulled my laptop from my bag and opened it. It was time to make a phone call. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile hospital room. I sat beside Patty, watching her fragile chest rise and fall under the thin hospital blanket. I did not have time to grieve the years I had lost with her. The police had given me exactly 24 hours to produce legal documentation, proving my right to protect my own wife. I opened my laptop on the small plastic tray table. I dialed a number I had not called since I signed my final logistics contract 2 years ago. Wallace picked up on the second ring. He was a corporate attorney who treated the law less like a profession and more like a blood sport. We had spent decades navigating the ruthless underbelly of international shipping contracts together. He was the only man I trusted to tear down a wall of lies this thick. I told Wallace exactly what had happened in the mudroom. I did not embellish. I gave him the cold, hard facts: the changed locks, the dog mat, the sedatives in her bloodstream, the Amber Alert Brent had filed against me. Wallace did not offer hollow sympathy. He asked for my social security number, Patty's details, and the address of the Stamford estate. I heard the rapid clacking of his keyboard over the phone line. He told me to give him 5 minutes, and his voice dropped an octave. He said he was pulling the financial history on my son-in-law right now. I looked at Patty's bruised wrists while I waited. For 24 months, I had frozen half to death on an Alaskan supply dock, sleeping in a cramped bunk, wiring $15,000 on the first of every single month. It was supposed to cover the property taxes, the maintenance, and Patty's medical aids. I had taken the brutal overseas contract specifically because Brent told me his tech startup was going through a temporary cash flow crisis. He had looked me in the eye and said he just needed a little help to keep a roof over my daughter's head. Wallace came back on the line. The sound of his typing had stopped. He told me that my son-in-law had never paid a single medical bill. He asked me to confirm the amount I had been wiring home. I told him $15,000 a month. Wallace let out a harsh breath. He explained that Brent had intercepted every single transfer. The money never touched the household accounts. Brent routed the funds through a shell company directly into his failing tech startup. He had been using the money I bled for in the snow to lease his luxury cars and throw lavish investor parties. A cold fury settled into my chest. Brent had not just neglected my wife. He had systematically starved and poisoned her to keep her trapped in that mudroom while living like a king on my dime. But Wallace was not finished. He told me to brace myself, because the stolen transfers were just the beginning. Wallace ran a shadow audit on the Stamford property deed. He revealed that Brent used a forged signature from Patty to secure a $3 million collateral loan against my mansion. I felt the breath leave my lungs. I asked how that was even legally possible. Wallace explained that Brent used the fraudulent medical power of attorney. He convinced the bank that Patty was of unsound mind and that he was acting as her legal proxy. He collateralized the home I built to save his sinking business. Patty stirred on the bed, her eyes fluttering open as the sedatives slowly lost their grip on her mind. She reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed my sleeve. She confessed the full horror to me in a broken whisper. She told me she had discovered the bank notices 3 months ago. She confronted Brent about the forged $3 million loan. That was the day he dragged her into the mudroom. That was the day the heavy sedatives started. And worst of all, she told me that Melanie knew. My daughter had stood in the hallway watching Brent lock the deadbolt and told her mother to just endure it so they would not go bankrupt. My own daughter had sentenced her mother to a chemical prison. She had watched Brent destroy the woman who gave her life and accepted it as the price of admission for her luxury cars and country club dinners. The betrayal was a physical weight crushing the last remnants of the father who had boarded a plane to Alaska 2 years ago. That man died right there in the emergency room. I looked at the vital monitors ticking beside the bed and asked Wallace what our timeline looked like. Wallace told me that Brent's investors from the dinner party were finalizing a $5 million buyout tomorrow morning. He warned me that if the ink dries on that contract, Brent will have enough liquid cash to flee the country or legally bury me in endless litigation. He would use the millions to legitimize the forged medical proxy and ensure Patty was locked in a state asylum forever. I thanked Wallace and closed the laptop. I did not feel panic. The cold logic of the logistics doc had completely taken over. Brent thought he had outsmarted a tired old man. He forgot that supply chains are built on leverage, and I was about to rip the foundation right out from under his life. I looked at the armed security guard I had stationed outside the hospital room door. I told him no one gets in, especially not anyone claiming to be family. I checked my watch. The investors were meeting Brent at sunrise. That gave me exactly 9 hours to break into my own mansion, secure the original forged documents, and dismantle my son-in-law's empire before he could destroy my wife. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor slowed to a steady, calm pace as the heavy chemical fog finally began to lift from my wife. I sat perfectly still beside the pristine white hospital bed. I watched her eyelids flutter and struggle against the harsh fluorescent lights of the room. It had been hours since I carried her out of that freezing mudroom. I waited with the absolute patience I had learned on the frozen docks of Alaska. I knew rushing her would only push her back into the panic Brent had so carefully cultivated. Her eyes opened completely. They were no longer cloudy and vacant. I saw the sharp, intelligent woman I had married 45 years ago staring back at me. She turned her head toward me and reached out her fragile hand. I gently took it between my calloused palms. She squeezed my fingers with a surprising amount of strength. She told me she thought I was never coming back. I kept my voice low and steady. I told her I was right here, and I was never leaving her side again. I asked her to tell me exactly what happened in our house. Patty swallowed hard and looked up at the sterile ceiling. The truth she poured out over the next few minutes shattered the last remaining illusions I had about my family. The betrayal began exactly 3 months ago. Patty explained she was looking for a misplaced tax document in Brent's home office. She opened his bottom desk drawer and found a stack of certified bank notices. They were default warnings on a $3 million collateral loan, a loan secured entirely by the deed to our Stamford estate. She saw her own signature on the bottom line of the promissory note. It was a flawless forgery. She confronted Brent the moment he walked through the door that evening. She demanded he explain why he had stolen the equity of the home we had worked our entire lives to pay for. Brent did not apologize or beg for forgiveness. Patty said his eyes just went completely dead. He grabbed her by the arm and dragged her down the hallway to the mudroom. He shoved her inside and locked the deadbolt. The physical abuse was horrific, but the psychological torture was worse. Patty wept as she explained how Brent brought her a glass of water that first night. The water tasted bitter and chalky. Within 20 minutes, she could barely keep her eyes open. She lost the ability to stand or form a coherent sentence. Brent kept her in a chemical haze, feeding her just enough laced broth to keep her alive, while he finalized his fraudulent financial maneuvers. I asked her the one question that was burning a hole through my chest. I asked her where Melanie was when all of this started. Patty squeezed her eyes shut, and a single tear rolled down her hollow cheek. She told me Melanie was standing right in the kitchen when Brent dragged her down the hall. My daughter had watched the man she married lock her mother in a freezing utility closet. Patty said she managed to stay awake long enough the next morning to beg Melanie for help through the crack under the door. She pleaded with our daughter to call the police or at least call me in Alaska. Melanie refused. Patty recounted the exact words our daughter used. Melanie knelt by the door and told her mother to just endure it so they would not go bankrupt. She said Brent just needed a little more time to close his big investor deal. She sacrificed her own mother to a chemical prison simply to maintain her country club memberships and her imported cars. I sat there absorbing the absolute rot that had infected my bloodline. I did not shed a tear. Grief is a luxury for people who are not in the middle of a war. I promised Patty she was safe now. I told her no one would ever lock her away again. My laptop chimed loudly from the small plastic tray table. It was a direct incoming video call from Wallace. I stepped away from the bed and answered the call. Wallace was sitting in his high-rise office with the city skyline behind him. He had stripped off his tie and his collar was unbuttoned. I knew that look. It meant he had found the kill shot, but it also meant we were completely out of time. Wallace did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me the situation was far worse than a simple bank fraud. He had traced the investor group that was attending Brent's dinner party. They were a massive venture capital firm looking to acquire Brent's tech startup. Wallace explained that Brent was not just trying to stay afloat. He was selling the entire fraudulent company for a lump sum of $5 million in cash. I asked him when the deal was supposed to close. Wallace leaned close to his webcam and delivered the crushing blow. The buyout was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The venture capital firm had rented a private boardroom downtown to sign the final paperwork. Wallace laid out the brutal mathematics of our reality. If Brent put his signature on that contract tomorrow, the money would be wired into an offshore account instantly. Brent would have enough liquid cash to flee the country by noon. Even if he decided to stay, $5 million would buy him an army of defense attorneys. He could easily drag the forgery case out for a decade. He could bury me in endless litigation until the bank finalized the foreclosure on our home. The 24-hour window the police had given me to produce legal documents was suddenly a luxury I did not have. We had less than 14 hours until Brent secured his victory and escaped all consequences. Wallace asked me what I wanted to do. He suggested we could try to file an emergency injunction to freeze the sale, but no judge would sign it in the middle of the night, based purely on a hospital toxicology report. We needed the original forged promissory note. We needed the tangible proof of his fraud to show the investors before they handed over the money. I looked back at Patty sleeping peacefully now that her nightmare was finally over. I thought about Brent wiping his dirty shoes on her blanket. I thought about Lanny telling her mother to endure the torture for the sake of a sports car. They thought they had cornered an old man who only knew how to work hard and stay quiet. They forgot that working on a remote logistics dock teaches you exactly how to dismantle a failing structure before it collapses on top of you. I turned my attention back to Wallace. I told him to draft the acceleration clause for the initial seed money I gave Brent years ago. I told him to have his best forensic accountant waiting for me at dawn. Wallace warned me that breaking into my own house while it was occupied by a desperate man was a massive risk. If Brent caught me inside, he could legally defend himself against an intruder. I closed the laptop, cutting off his warning. I did not care about the risk. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. I was going to retrieve the original forged documents from Brent's safe. Then I was going to walk directly into that luxury boardroom tomorrow morning and burn his empire to the ground. I sat in the sterile silence of the hospital room, watching the steady rise and fall of Patty's chest under the thin cotton blanket. The armed private security guard I had hired stood just outside the door, an immovable barrier against anyone attempting to claim medical guardianship. I did not have time to sit and hold her hand. The police had given me a strict 24-hour window to produce documentation proving Brent's fraud, or they would return my wife to her abuser. I opened my laptop on the small plastic tray table and dialed a number I had not used since I signed my final logistics contract in Alaska. Wallace answered on the second ring. He was a ruthless corporate attorney, a man who treated international law as a contact sport, and my oldest friend. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him everything. I detailed the changed locks, the dog mat in the mudroom, the unprescribed sedatives in Patty's blood, and the Amber Alert Brent had weaponized against me. Wallace did not offer hollow sympathy. He asked for Brent's full legal name, my social security number, and the address of the Stamford estate. I heard the rapid, aggressive clacking of his keyboard over the phone line. He told me to give him 5 minutes, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, as he initiated a preliminary shadow audit on my son-in-law. While I waited, Patty stirred on the bed. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against the heavy chemical fog that Brent had forced upon her. She turned her head toward me, her eyes slowly focusing. The confusion gave way to a heartbreaking clarity. She reached out with a frail, bruised hand and gripped my sleeve. I leaned in, keeping my voice soft, promising her that she was safe and that I was never leaving again. She confessed the entire horror to me in a broken whisper. 3 months ago, she had been looking for a misplaced utility bill in Brent's home office. She opened a locked drawer and discovered a stack of certified bank notices. They were default warnings on a $3 million collateral loan. A loan secured entirely by the deed to the home I had spent my life paying for. She saw her own signature on the bottom of the promissory note, a blatant forgery. Patty told me she confronted Brent the moment he walked through the door that evening. He did not apologize. He did not explain. She said his eyes simply went dead. He grabbed her by the arm, dragged her down the hall, and shoved her into the mudroom, locking the deadbolt behind her. That was the day the heavy sedatives began. He kept her docile, feeding her laced broth just to keep her alive while he finalized his financial crimes. I asked her where Melanie was when the abuse started. Patty closed her eyes, tears leaking onto the hospital pillow. She told me our daughter was standing right there in the kitchen. Melanie watched Brent lock her mother in a freezing closet. Patty said she had begged Melanie through the bottom of the door to call the police, to call me in Alaska, to do anything. Melanie had simply knelt by the door and told her mother to just endure it so they would not go bankrupt. My own daughter had chosen a life of luxury over her mother's survival. Wallace came back on the line, his typing coming to an abrupt halt. He told me the situation was far worse than a simple case of elder abuse. He explained that Brent had intercepted every single $15,000 check I wired home from the Arctic. The money never went to property taxes or Patty's care. Brent routed it through a shell company to keep his failing tech startup afloat. Furthermore, Wallace had tracked down the investor group that was attending Brent's dinner party. They were a massive venture capital firm finalizing a $5 million buyout of Brent's company. Wallace delivered the crushing reality of our timeline. The investors were meeting Brent in a private downtown boardroom tomorrow morning at 9:00 to sign the final contracts. If the ink dried on that paper, Brent would instantly have $5 million in liquid cash. He would have enough money to flee the jurisdiction, or worse, hire an army of defense attorneys to legitimize his forged medical proxy and bury me in endless litigation. The 24-hour window the police gave me was an illusion. We had less than 14 hours before Brent secured his victory. I thanked Wallace and closed the laptop. I instructed him to draft the acceleration clause for the initial seed money I had given Brent years ago, and to have his best forensic accountant waiting for me at dawn. I looked at Patty sleeping peacefully, knowing I had to leave her again. I walked out of the hospital into the biting Connecticut night. I drove to my neighborhood and parked 3 blocks away from the sprawling estate. The driveway was empty. Brent and Melanie were out at an upscale restaurant celebrating their impending millions. I slipped through the side service door, moving silently through the dark, empty house. I walked straight past the mudroom and entered Brent's master study. Behind a large painting on the back wall was a digital safe he had once bragged about. I pulled the painting down and stared at the keypad. Arrogant men are universally predictable. I typed in the exact date he incorporated his startup. A green light flashed and the heavy steel door clicked open. I pulled out a stack of thick manila folders. The first contained the original promissory note for the $3 million loan. I recognized the forged signature instantly and tucked the document into my jacket. The second folder was much heavier, bearing the seal of a state psychiatric facility. As I read the pages, the blood in my veins turned to ice. It was a formal, expedited commitment order scheduled for next Tuesday. Brent had paid a corrupt private physician to fabricate a medical evaluation stating Patty was violently schizophrenic. Once the buyout cleared, he was going to have my wife locked in a state asylum forever. I turned to the final page and saw Melanie's signature authorizing the commitment. My daughter had signed away her mother's life. I moved to his desktop computer and plugged in a high-capacity encrypted flash drive. I bypassed the login screen using a diagnostic backdoor sequence and initiated a full clone of his hard drive. The progress bar crawled across the screen, estimating 15 agonizing minutes. Every creaking floorboard sounded like a car door slamming in the driveway. I stood in the dark watching the percentage climb, securing the digital receipts for the illegal sedatives he had purchased offshore. At 95%, headlights swept across the front lawn. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart hammering, until the delivery truck passed by. The monitor chimed a soft completion tone. I yanked the flash drive free, closed the safe, and replaced the painting. I slipped out the back door into the freezing wind, my coat heavy with the evidence of his destruction. I had the forged loan. I had the asylum papers. I had his entire digital life. The hunt was over, and tomorrow morning I was going to drop a financial guillotine on my son-in-law. The morning sun reflected blindly off the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown executive boardroom. It was exactly 8:55. I stood in the marble hallway outside the frosted glass doors, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration inside. The clinking of expensive porcelain coffee cups. The deep, confident laughter of men who believed they were about to secure a fortune. Inside that room sat Brent. My son-in-law was sitting at the head of a massive glass table wearing a bespoke suit paid for with the money he had stolen from my wife. He was holding a gold fountain pen, hovering at just inches above a contract that would hand him $5 million in liquid cash. He thought he had won. He thought Patty was chemically locked away in a hospital bed, and that I was just a tired old man who could be intimidated by a police warning. He thought he was untouchable. I looked to my left. Wallace stood beside me. My oldest friend and corporate attorney looked like a shark smelling blood in the water. His suit was immaculate, and his expression was completely devoid of mercy. To my right stood a man Wallace had brought with him, a private forensic accountant holding a thick, heavy leather binder. That binder contained the cloned hard drive data, the forged medical proxy, the fake asylum commitment papers, and the original forged promissory note I had extracted from Brent's safe just hours ago. I did not feel anger. I did not feel the blind rage that had almost consumed me the night before. Alaska had taught me how to pack my fury into a tight, cold box. I reached out and pushed the heavy oak and glass doors open. The heavy doors swung wide, hitting the rubber wall stops with a dull thud that echoed across the quiet boardroom. The cheerful chatter inside died instantly. 5 men were seated around the polished glass table. 3 of them were the venture capitalists from the venture firm. The other two were the wealthy investors Brent had brought to my mudroom the previous night. And at the head of the table was Brent. His golden pen froze in midair. The smug, triumphant smile melted off his face so fast it looked as if his skin had caught fire. The color drained completely from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. For a fraction of a second, he simply stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, like a suffocating fish. He had expected to sign this paper and vanish. He had never expected the ghost of his father-in-law to walk into his fortress. "Get out!" Brent suddenly shouted, his voice cracking as he scrambled out of his plush leather chair. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Security! Somebody call the building security right now. This man is trespassing. He is a dangerous individual." Two private security guards positioned near the corner of the room immediately stepped forward, placing their hands on their radios. But I did not stop walking. I stepped fully into the room, my boots sinking silently into the expensive carpet. Wallace entered right behind me, followed closely by the accountant. We moved with a synchronized, deliberate pace that carried the undeniable weight of authority. "I am not leaving," I said, my voice low and steady. It cut through Brent's hysterical shouting like a blade. "I am here to correct a massive financial oversight regarding the ownership of the intellectual property you are attempting to purchase today." Brent slammed his hands down on the glass table. "Do not listen to him," he pleaded with the investors, his eyes wide and frantic. "He is a deranged old man. He is my father-in-law. He has been estranged for years, and he is trying to extort me because my company is finally taking off. Guards, remove him immediately." The guards stepped closer, reaching for my arms. But before they could make contact, the lead investor from the venture capital firm raised his hand. It was one of the men from the mudroom, the man who had stood there sipping champagne while Brent wiped the mud from his Italian loafers onto my starving wife's blanket. The investor stared at me, his eyes narrowing as he recognized my face. The memory of the previous night washed over his expression. He remembered the cold logic in my eyes when I told him who really owned the floor he was standing on. He remembered the absolute terror on Brent's face when I dropped him to his knees with a single twist of his wrist. "Hold on," the lead investor commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He turned his cold gaze toward the security guards. "Nobody touches him. Step back." The guards immediately retreated, lowering their hands and stepping back into the shadows of the room. They knew who signed their paychecks, and it certainly was not Brent. Brent looked at the lead investor as if he had just been stabbed. "Gentlemen, you cannot be serious," he stammered, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "We are minutes away from closing a $5 million acquisition. This man has absolutely zero legal standing here. He is lying. He is trying to ruin this deal out of pure spite." The lead investor leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers together. He looked at Brent, and then he looked directly at me. "I believe this is the gentleman who owns the estate in Stamford," the investor said, his voice dripping with sudden, dangerous curiosity. "The one whose wife you claimed was your dementia-riddled maid. The one you were legally obligated to care for while you lived in his house." Brent swallowed hard, visibly trembling. The perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. "That is a private family matter," he choked out, trying to regain his professional composure. "It has absolutely nothing to do with the valuation of my tech company or the transfer of these assets. I have the legal right to sell this company today." Wallace finally stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He moved to the edge of the glass table, projecting the aura of a man who held the executioner's axe. "Actually," he said, addressing the entire room with a smooth, predatory cadence that is exactly what we are here to discuss. "The legality of the assets you are attempting to acquire." Wallace gestured to the forensic accountant. The quiet man stepped forward, holding the thick leather binder with both hands. He did not speak a single word. He simply walked to the center of the majestic glass table right in front of the $5 million contract that was waiting for Brent's signature. I walked forward and stood directly across the table from my son-in-law. He looked up at me, his eyes darting frantically, looking for any possible escape route. There was no escape. The doors were behind me. The investors were watching his every move. He was entirely trapped in a cage of his own making. I looked down at the leather binder. It represented 2 years of my frozen labor. It represented the brutal chemical torture my wife had endured while trapped in a dark room. It represented the absolute betrayal of my daughter, who had chosen money over her own mother's life. I did not scream. I did not flip the table or grab him by his tailored lapels. I simply reached out and took the heavy leather binder from the accountant. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of the evidence. Then I raised it up and dropped it directly onto the center of the glass table. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The binder landed squarely on top of the $5 million buyout contract, completely covering the signature line. Brent stared at the binder as if it were a live grenade. The color was entirely gone from his face. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He knew exactly what kind of man I was. He knew that I did not make empty threats. If I had walked into this room and placed that binder on his contract, it meant I had found his secrets. It meant I had been inside his safe. The lead investor leaned forward, looking at the leather binder and then up at me. "And what exactly is this?" he asked, his tone shifting from curious to completely analytical. He was a man who protected his money above all else, and he could smell a bad investment burning in the room. "This," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Brent's terrified face, "is the absolute truth about the man sitting across from you. It is the complete forensic and legal documentation proving that the company you are about to purchase was built entirely on stolen funds, forged signatures, and the systematic physical abuse of a senior citizen." Brent let out a strangled gasp. He reached out blindly, as if he wanted to snatch the binder off the table, but his hands were shaking too violently. "You cannot do this," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic plea. "Gerald, please. We can talk about this. I can give you a percentage. We can make a deal. Do not do this to me." I ignored his begging. I looked at the lead investor and placed my hand flat on top of the leather cover. I told the room that if they signed that contract today, they would not be acquiring a tech startup. They would be acquiring a massive criminal liability, and I would personally ensure that every single one of their venture capital funds was named as a co-conspirator in the federal wire fraud and elder abuse lawsuits my attorney was filing in exactly 1 hour. The entire boardroom fell dead silent. The investors looked at the binder. Then they looked at Brent, who was currently sinking back into his chair, a completely broken, ruined man. The absolute destruction of his empire had officially begun. The heavy leather binder hit the glass table with a dull, echoing thud that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the room. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of deep, suffocating quiet that precedes a catastrophic collapse. The 5 men seated around the long, polished table froze. At the far end, Brent sat in his high-backed leather chair, his hand trembling so violently that the expensive gold fountain pen slipped from his fingers and clattered against the glass. He had been mere seconds away from signing a contract that would hand him $5 million. Now all the color drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, chalky pallor. He stared at the binder as if it were a live explosive. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. In the freezing isolation of the Alaskan supply docks, I learned that true authority never shouts. It simply occupies the space and suffocates everything else. I placed my hand flat on the leather cover and flipped it open. I pulled out a stack of crisp white documents. I looked directly at the lead venture capitalist, the same wealthy investor who had stood in my mudroom the night before, sipping champagne while Brent wiped mud onto my starving wife's blanket. I slid a copy of the document across the smooth glass. It stopped perfectly in front of him. I distributed the remaining copies to the other investors, completely ignoring Brent's frantic, high-pitched stammering. Brent scrambled to his feet, his chair rolling back and hitting the wall. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his chest heaving. He begged the investors not to look at the papers. He claimed I was a deranged, estranged relative trying to extort him, that I was a bitter old man trying to ruin his moment of triumph out of pure spite. He demanded that someone call building security to have me forcibly removed. The lead investor did not call security. He did not even look at Brent. His eyes were locked on my face, recognizing the cold, unyielding expression of the man who had effortlessly dropped his host to the floor the previous evening. He raised a single hand, a gesture of total, unquestionable command, and ordered Brent to sit down and close his mouth. The authority in the investor's voice stripped Brent of his remaining bravado. Brent collapsed back into his chair, sweating profusely, his tailored suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. I stepped back from the table and clasped my hands behind my back. I told the room that they were about to make a $5 million mistake. I instructed them to read the first page of the document they were holding. I kept my voice low, measuring out the words with a slow, mechanical precision. I asked the venture capitalists what Brent had told them about the initial seed capital used to build his startup. The lead investor scanned the top paragraph, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. Without looking up, he answered that Brent had claimed the initial $2.5 million came from a deceased relative, a wealthy uncle who had left behind a blind trust, providing the foundational wealth needed to code the proprietary software and secure the initial patents. I nodded slowly, letting the lie hang in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the boardroom. I told them it was a fascinating story, a brilliant narrative designed to project an image of generational wealth, stability, and inevitable success. But it was entirely fiction. There was no wealthy uncle. There was no blind trust. There was only a father-in-law who had believed in his daughter's future enough to sacrifice his own. I walked slowly around the edge of the glass table, the rhythmic sound of my boots keeping time with the pounding of Brent's heart. I told the investors the truth. The $2.5 million was a bridge loan funded entirely by me. I explained how I had liquidated my own modest retirement accounts, sold off physical assets, and taken a grueling high-risk logistics contract on the Arctic Ocean, just to guarantee the line of credit. I spent 24 months breathing air so cold it felt like inhaling broken glass. I worked 80-hour weeks on a frozen, sunless supply dock, managing heavy freight and dangerous cargo wiring, every single cent back to Connecticut. I funded the code they were so eager to buy. I funded the servers. I funded the polished glass table and the Italian leather chair Brent was currently sweating in. The room was dead silent. The investors looked from the paper to Brent, observing the sheer panic radiating from his trembling frame. I stopped pacing and stood directly behind Brent, looking down at the top of his perfectly styled hair. I explained that while I may be a blue-collar logistics manager, I was not a fool. I knew that tech startups were volatile, high-risk ventures built on fragile promises. Because of that risk, I had my corporate attorney Wallace draft the original promissory note. It was never a gift. It was a heavily collateralized debt. I instructed the investors to turn to the second page and locate paragraph 4. I told them to read the collateral terms out loud. The lead investor traced the line of text with his index finger, his eyes widening as he comprehended the legal reality of the document. He read the clause, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The loan was secured by the entirety of the company's intellectual property. All of it. Every single line of code, every patent, every proprietary algorithm, and every trademark Brent was attempting to sell to them today legally belonged to me in the event of a default. Brent let out a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. He slammed his hands onto the table, leaving sweaty palm prints on the glass. He desperately claimed that the loan was in good standing. He swore he had been making the minimum interest payments, routing the money through the shell accounts. He insisted I had no legal right to interfere with the sale because the debt was not currently in default. He looked at the investors, his eyes wide and pleading, begging them to believe that this was just a minor administrative hurdle that he could easily clear once they wired him the $5 million. I leaned down, placing both of my hands on the back of Brent's chair. I lowered my face until I was inches from his ear, my voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper that carried to every corner of the room. I told him to look at Section 7. The lead investor flipped to the next page, his eyes darting across the heavy legal jargon. Section 7 was the acceleration clause. I explained the terms with a slow, lethal clarity. The clause stated that the entirety of the principal, plus all compounded interest and maximum financial penalties, became immediately due and payable in full upon the discovery of severe fiduciary breach, criminal fraud, or gross moral turpitude involving the lender's immediate family. I stood up straight and looked directly at the lead investor. I announced that as of 3 o'clock this morning, upon discovering my wife shivering on a dog mat with unprescribed sedatives in her bloodstream, I had formally invoked the acceleration clause. I demanded immediate repayment of the original capital plus 24 months of maximum penalty interest. The total sum was $3.8 million, and it was payable right this exact second. Brent let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. The air rushed out of his lungs as the absolute finality of his situation crashed down upon him. He did not have $3.8 million. He did not even have a fraction of it. His company was running on empty fumes, sustained only by the money he had stolen from Patty's medical accounts and the fraudulent $3 million mortgage he had forged against my estate. In the span of 30 agonizing seconds, Brent's company had gone from a highly anticipated lucrative tech acquisition to a completely, irrevocably insolvent nightmare. The lead investor carefully set the promissory note down on the glass. He looked at Brent with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The venture capitalists were ruthless men who understood the mechanics of power and money. They realized instantly what was happening. If they signed the buyout contract today, they would not be acquiring a revolutionary tech startup. They would be buying a hollow, empty shell. The intellectual property they coveted was legally locked behind a toxic mountain of debt held by a man who would gladly burn it all to ash before letting them use a single line of code. The investor looked down at the $5 million contract sitting perfectly centered in front of Brent. The gold pen was still lying beside it, waiting for the signature that would never come. The investor reached out his hand. Brent lunged forward across the table, his arms flailing as he cried out. He begged the investor to wait. He promised he could clear the debt, that he could fix the forgery, that he could negotiate a settlement if they just gave him an advance. He sobbed, the polished, arrogant tech CEO completely vanishing, replaced by a desperate, ruined boy terrified of the consequences of his own actions. The lead investor ignored him completely. He picked up the thick stack of premium paper containing the buyout agreement. He gripped it firmly with both hands, his knuckles turning white, and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of ripping paper was the loudest, most violent noise in the room. He dropped the torn, jagged halves onto the glass table right on top of Brent's sweaty handprints. The investor calmly fastened the center button of his tailored suit jacket. He looked down at Brent and stated with ice-cold finality that their firm did not do business with insolvent entities, and they certainly did not do business with cowards who wiped their shoes on starving women. The other investors did not say a word. They silently snapped their leather briefcases shut. They did not look at Brent again. They treated him as if he had a highly contagious disease. The men walked around the table, passing by me and Wallace. The lead investor offered me a brief, deeply respectful nod, acknowledging the utter devastation I had just orchestrated. They marched out the heavy oak doors, their footsteps fading down the marble hallway. The room emptied, the grand illusion of success evaporating into the morning air. I stood in silence, looking down at the torn contract. I had triggered the financial guillotine, leaving nothing but Wallace the accountant and a completely ruined man gasping for air at the head of a shattered empire. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing us inside the boardroom. The silence was absolute. Brent was entirely alone. He stood at the head of the long glass table, staring down at the ripped pieces of the $5 million contract. The venture capitalists had left his grand illusion in shreds. His breathing was ragged and shallow. His chest heaved under the expensive fabric of his tailored suit. I watched a single bead of sweat trace a path down his temple and drop onto the glass surface. I did not say a word. I simply stood there, letting the crushing weight of his financial ruin press the oxygen out of his lungs. Wallace stood to my left with his hands resting casually in his pockets. He watched my son-in-law with the cold detachment of a man observing a wounded animal in a trap. Fear is a predictable mechanism. When a desperate man realizes he has lost his shield, he will inevitably reach for a weapon. Brent wiped his face with a trembling hand. The sheer panic in his eyes slowly morphed into a cornered manic aggression. He let out a harsh, broken laugh that bounced off the empty walls. He told me I was an absolute fool. He said I thought I had won because I chased away his investors, but I did not understand how the real game was played. He claimed I was just an uneducated logistics worker who had stumbled into a corporate battlefield. Brent reached inside his jacket. His fingers were shaking so violently that he struggled to grasp the fabric of his inner pocket. He pulled out a folded document heavily stamped with official blue ink. He slammed it down onto the glass table right next to the shredded remains of his buyout agreement. He smoothed the thick paper out with frantic, sweaty palms. He pointed a shaking finger at the heavy black signature line at the very bottom of the page. He demanded that I read it carefully. He declared that the paper was a fully executed and legally binding medical and financial power of attorney. He claimed my wife had signed it over to him 3 months ago when her mind supposedly began slipping into dementia. He sneered at me, his lips curling into an ugly, desperate grin. He stated that the proxy gave him absolute and irrevocable control over every aspect of Patty's life. He boasted that he controlled her medical decisions, her bank accounts, and most importantly, her exact half of the equity in our Stamford estate. Brent leaned over the table, attempting to project a physical dominance that his trembling knees completely undermined. He told me that my acceleration clause meant absolutely nothing to him. He claimed that because I did not hold sole ownership of the assets, I could not legally freeze the estate. He outlined his final desperate maneuver with breathless, rapid-fire precision. He stated that as Patty's legal proxy, he possessed the unilateral authority to liquidate her half of the property immediately. He threatened to sell the mansion to an anonymous cash buyer by 5 o'clock this evening. He said he had a fast-track escrow agent on standby who bypassed standard waiting periods for distressed sales. He looked me dead in the eye and promised to take the liquidated cash to pay off his fractional debt. He swore he would route the remaining equity through untraceable offshore accounts and leave me standing in the cold with absolutely nothing to my name. He told me I would be homeless and bankrupt by nightfall. He thought the threat of losing the house would break me. He assumed the mansion was my ultimate weakness because he knew exactly what I had endured to secure it. He knew I had spent 24 months on a freezing Alaskan dock, destroying my own spine and freezing my hands to pay off that mortgage. He calculated that I valued the brick and mortar of that estate more than I valued the reality of his crimes. He did not realize that the moment I walked into that dark mudroom and found my wife shivering on a filthy dog mat, the house ceased to be a home. It became nothing more than a crime scene. I felt absolutely zero attachment to a structure built on my wife's suffering. I did not flinch. I did not even glance down at the document he was practically shoving into my face. I looked directly into his bloodshot, panicked eyes. I told him in a voice devoid of any emotion that he was holding a fraudulent piece of paper. I stated that Patty had never signed that proxy willingly. I laid out the exact truth of his deception. I told him I knew he had locked her in the mudroom and force-fed her unprescribed sedatives to keep her compliant, while he falsified a notary seal and forged her signature. Brent laughed again. It was a high-pitched, hysterical sound that lacked any real confidence. He challenged me to prove it. He asked how a blue-collar truck driver was ever going to prove a complex medical forgery against a legally stamped document in a court of law. He claimed the bank had already verified the signature. He said the state authorities had already processed the proxy. He boasted that the legal system was designed to protect men like him. He warned me that by the time I managed to file a single piece of paperwork to contest the signature, The house would be sold and the money would be gone. He leaned closer across the glass, his breath smelling of stale coffee and pure desperation. He promised me that once he had the cash, he would use his power of attorney to have Patty permanently committed to a state psychiatric ward. He swore I would never see my wife again. He told me I was completely out of my league and that I had brought a wrench to a corporate knife fight. I let his pathetic threats hang in the silence of the room. I let him taste the false hope that he still held a winning hand. I did not argue with his legal theories. I did not try to convince him that his plan was flawed. I simply stood there and watched a dead man pretend he was still breathing. I glanced over at Wallace. My attorney did not look worried. He simply checked his watch with absolute calculating indifference. The trap was now fully set. Brent had just confessed his reliance on a forged medical document in a room with a federal contractor and a corporate lawyer. He had walked directly into the center of the kill zone, holding the very rope that was about to hang him. The silence in the boardroom was absolute as Brent held his forged power of attorney. He was breathing heavily and expecting me to beg for my home. He expected me to negotiate. I did not move a single muscle. I watched his desperate grin slowly falter as he realized his ultimate weapon had completely failed to elicit a reaction. He had tried to leverage my property against me, but he did not understand that brick and mortar meant absolutely nothing compared to the survival of my wife. Wallace stepped forward. His polished leather shoes made a soft, rhythmic sound against the thick carpet. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a second folder. This one was thin and pristine white. He held it out over the glass table and let it drop. It landed softly right next to the shredded pieces of the buyout contract. Wallace looked at Brent with the cold, mechanical detachment of a butcher examining a block of meat. Wallace stated that a power of attorney is instantly nullified when the signature is obtained under extreme chemical duress. He instructed my son-in-law to open the white folder. Brent stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the edge of the cover. He flipped it open. His bloodshot eyes scanned the first page, and all the remaining color completely drained from his neck and face. His jaw went slack. The arrogant sneer he had worn just moments ago evaporated into pure, unadulterated terror. I kept my voice low and perfectly even. I told him he was looking at an emergency toxicology report from Stamford Memorial Hospital. I explained that it had been personally administered and expedited by the chief of medicine at 3:00 this morning. I watched Brent swallow hard. I told him the blood work revealed massive and lethal concentrations of a highly regulated synthetic sedative. It was a brutal chemical compound designed to suppress the central nervous system and induce severe memory loss. I stepped closer to the edge of the glass table. I told him the hospital had signed a sworn affidavit stating Patty had absolutely no legal prescriptions for this narcotic. The chief of medicine had officially declared her condition a result of sustained systematic poisoning. Brent stumbled backward until his legs hit his heavy leather chair. He gripped the armrests, trying to keep himself upright. He stammered that it was a huge mistake. He tried to claim that Patty must have taken the pills herself because she was confused and elderly. He desperately tried to cling to the narrative that he was simply a caring family member dealing with a tragic mental decline. I did not let him finish his pathetic lie. I reminded him about the digital clone of his hard drive resting safely in my accountant's leather binder. I explained the fatal mistake he had made in his sheer arrogance. I told him that forensic experts had already matched the exact synthetic compound in my wife's blood to a series of encrypted purchases he had made on the dark web over the last 3 months. He had left a permanent digital receipt for the poison he used to torture her. Wallace leaned over the table and delivered the most devastating piece of legal reality. He explained that Brent had not used his own private funds to purchase the illegal narcotics. Brent had been so desperate to maintain his lavish lifestyle that he routed the dark web purchases through his tech startup's corporate accounts. He had used the exact same seed money I provided him to buy the chemicals used to imprison my wife. Wallace smiled a cold, predatory smile. He told Brent that by using corporate funds to purchase illegal offshore narcotics, He had officially triggered federal wire fraud statutes. He had crossed the line from domestic abuse into a massive federal crime. The forged power of attorney slipped from Brent's sweaty fingers. The thick paper fluttered harmlessly to the floor. He collapsed into his chair. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He was completely trapped. The financial ruin of his company was no longer his primary concern. He was staring directly down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence. He looked up at me with wet, pathetic eyes. He begged me not to do this. He swore he would sign the house back over to me immediately. He promised he would walk away from Melanie and never contact our family again. He offered to leave the state today if I just agreed to bury the toxicology report and the digital evidence. He was willing to surrender everything just to keep his freedom. I looked down at the man who had dragged my wife into a freezing closet. I thought about Patty struggling to keep her eyes open while he fed her laced water. I thought about the absolute disregard he had shown for human life, simply to maintain his luxury cars and his country club memberships. I told him I was not here to negotiate a property dispute. I told him I did not care about the house or the money or his empty promises. I leaned over the glass table until I was directly in his line of sight. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision. I told him that the 24-hour window the police had given me the previous night was not a grace period for him to fix his mistakes. It was the exact amount of time I needed to secure a watertight criminal indictment. Brent let out a suffocating gasp. He looked frantically toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. I told him not to bother running. I explained that the local authorities were not treating this as a simple civil misunderstanding anymore. I told him that 2 senior detectives and a squad of uniformed officers were currently sitting in the polished marble lobby on the ground floor of this very building. They were not here to serve property papers. They were waiting patiently by the elevators with a signed warrant for his immediate arrest. I listed his charges slowly so he could absorb the absolute destruction of his future. I told him he was being indicted for felony elder abuse. I told him he was being charged with severe chemical endangerment of a vulnerable adult. I reminded him of the federal wire fraud charges waiting for him regarding his corporate accounts. Brent's entire body began to shake. He curled inward, pulling his knees to his chest like a frightened child. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The wealthy, brilliant tech chief executive was gone. All that remained was a pathetic criminal waiting for the steel handcuffs to snap around his wrists. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I simply turned my back on him. I nodded to Wallace and the accountant. We walked away from the glass table, leaving the shredded contracts and the toxicology report behind. I pushed the heavy boardroom doors open and walked out into the bright hallway. My wife was finally safe, and the man who hurt her was about to lose everything. The silence inside the executive boardroom was heavy and absolute. Brent stood frozen at the head of the long glass table, staring at the shredded remains of his $5 million contract. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. He was completely out of options. He had tried to use my home as a weapon against me, but his fraudulent power of attorney had just been obliterated by the sheer weight of medical evidence. Wallace stood quietly by the windows, projecting the calm indifference of a man who had already won the war. We did not have to wait long for the final consequence to arrive. The heavy oak doors swung open for the third and final time. Melanie walked into the room first. My daughter was wearing a pristine white designer dress and carrying a chilled bottle of imported champagne. She had a bright, oblivious smile plastered across her face. She had obviously been waiting in a downstairs lobby, expecting to make a grand entrance to celebrate her husband's monumental financial victory. Instead, she found a graveyard of torn legal documents and a suffocating tension that felt like an open tomb. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing next to the glass table. The bottle of champagne slipped through her manicured fingers and crashed against the polished marble floor. The green glass shattered, sending a foaming puddle of alcohol expanding across the tiles. Before Melanie could even utter a single word of surprise, 2 plainclothes detectives stepped into the boardroom right behind her. They were tall, broad-shouldered men who radiated the absolute uncompromising authority of the law. They stepped over the pooling champagne and broken glass without breaking their stride or looking down. They completely ignored Melanie and locked their gaze directly on Brent. The lead detective pulled a leather badge holder from his belt and announced his presence. His voice was calm, but it carried a deep, resonant weight that made the remaining oxygen flee the room. The detective addressed Brent by his full legal name. He stated clearly that they possessed a warrant for his immediate arrest. The detective did not rush through the official charges. He read them aloud with deliberate, agonizing clarity so that every single person in the room understood the exact nature of the crimes. He listed felony elder abuse. He listed severe chemical endangerment of a vulnerable adult. He finished with federal wire fraud and identity theft. Every single word spoken by the detective was another nail being hammered firmly into Brent's coffin. The second detective moved fluidly around the edge of the shattered glass and approached the head of the table. He unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clinking sound echoed sharply against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Panic is a remarkable truth serum. The moment Brent heard the distinct sound of the steel handcuffs, his survival instincts completely hijacked whatever remained of his manufactured corporate persona. He backed away from the table, holding his trembling hands up in a desperate defensive posture. He looked at the two detectives with wide, bloodshot eyes and began to hyperventilate. He pointed a shaking, sweating finger across the room directly at his wife. He screamed that they had the wrong person. He yelled that he had absolutely nothing to do with the physical administration of the narcotics. He claimed with complete conviction that the entire chemical imprisonment was solely Melanie's idea from the very beginning. Melanie gasped as if all the air had been violently punched out of her lungs. She pressed her back against the polished wood paneling of the boardroom wall. Brent did not stop talking. He threw the woman he supposedly loved completely under the bus without a single second of hesitation or remorse. He shrieked that Melanie was the one who coveted the Stamford estate and wanted to secure the inheritance. He claimed she was the one who crushed the heavy sedatives into a fine powder. He swore to the detectives that Melanie had personally mixed the dangerous chemicals into Patty's warm broth while he was busy working in his study. He screamed that he was just a busy executive and that his wife had orchestrated the entire nightmare to protect her luxury lifestyle. I stood perfectly still, watching the absolute moral rot of my bloodline expose itself in the bright morning light. I knew Brent was lying to save his own skin. I had the digital receipts proving he had purchased the drugs himself. I knew he was the one who had locked the heavy deadbolt on the mudroom door. But his cowardly, frantic accusation tore away the last remaining veil of illusion Melanie held about her marriage. The man she had sacrificed her own suffering mother for was now eagerly offering her up to a lengthy federal prison sentence just to buy himself a tiny sliver of reasonable doubt. Melanie slid slowly down the wall until she collapsed onto the floor. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest and wrapped her arms around her legs. She began to weep. It was not a quiet, sorrowful cry. It was the loud, hysterical wailing of a woman who had just watched her entire universe collapse into a black hole of permanent consequences. She shook her head back and forth violently, unable to form a single coherent sentence to defend herself against her husband's vicious lies. The hem of her expensive white dress was soaking up the spilled champagne, but she did not care. She simply shrank into the corner, a broken, pathetic shell of the arrogant daughter who had once told her mother to endure torture for the sake of an imported sports car. The lead detective did not entertain Brent's hysterical deflections for another second. He simply nodded his head toward his partner. The second detective lunged forward and grabbed Brent forcefully by the shoulder. He spun my son-in-law around and slammed him face down onto the polished glass table. The heavy impact rattled the thick glass surface. Brent cried out in pain and shock as the detective wrenched his arms behind his back. The heavy steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a loud, decisive click, securing his arms tightly together. Brent struggled against the rigid restraint, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the table legs. He thrashed his head from side to side, sobbing openly in front of the men who had come to ruin him. He begged the detectives to look at his phone. He pleaded with them to check the security cameras at the house. He screamed repeatedly that Melanie was the real monster, and that he was just a desperate man trying to keep his failing company afloat. The detectives completely ignored his pathetic rambling. They hauled him upright, yanking him roughly by his restrained arms. They began to drag him away from the table and toward the exit. As they dragged him past me, Brent locked his tear-filled eyes onto mine. He looked like a terrified lost child begging for a parent to wake him up from a horrible nightmare. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg me for a shred of mercy, but I simply turned my head away. I refused to grant him the dignity of an acknowledgement. He was nothing to me anymore. He was just a common thief who had stolen time from my wife, and he was finally going to pay his debt in a concrete cell. The detectives dragged him out into the marble hallway. His desperate screams echoed down the long corridor, bouncing off the walls until the elevator doors finally slid shut, cutting his voice off completely. The sudden quiet that settled over the boardroom was heavy and incredibly final. Wallace picked up his white folder from the table, leaving the shredded contract where it lay. He adjusted his suit jacket and walked toward the exit, completely ignoring the weeping woman huddled in the corner. I stood there for one final moment, breathing in the sterile air of the room. The long hunt was officially over. I turned my back on the wreckage and walked out, leaving Melanie alone on the wet floor to drown in the absolute silence of her choices. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the detectives, leaving the boardroom in absolute silence. The only sound remaining in the vast space was the ragged sobbing of my daughter. Melanie was still huddled on the floor in the corner of the room. Her pristine white designer dress was completely soaked in spilled champagne and scattered with shards of green glass. She looked like a broken porcelain doll, discarded among the ruins of her own greed. Wallace and the forensic accountant silently gathered their leather binders and laptops. They did not spare a single glance for the weeping woman on the floor. Wallace gave me a curt nod before he opened the door and walked out into the hallway. I was finally alone with the woman who had watched her mother suffer and did absolutely nothing. I stood near the edge of the glass table, looking down at the torn pieces of the $5 million contract. I listened to Melanie gasp for air. Slowly, she raised her head and looked at me. Her expensive makeup was smeared across her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She saw the cold, empty expression on my face, and panic washed over her features. She realized that her husband was gone and her financial shield was completely destroyed. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pieces of broken glass that bit into her palms. She crawled across the wet marble floor until she reached my boots. She wrapped her arms tightly around my legs and buried her wet face against my trousers. She began to beg. The words poured out of her in a frantic, desperate torrent. She pleaded with me to forgive her. She claimed she had absolutely no idea how far Brent was willing to go. She swore she was terrified of him and that he controlled every single aspect of their lives. She said Brent was a monster who threatened to leave her with nothing if she did not comply with his plans. She wept and told me she wanted to call the police for her mother, but she was completely paralyzed by fear. She painted herself as a helpless victim trapped in a golden cage, unable to break free from her husband's tyrannical grip. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, expecting to see the forgiving father who used to carry her on his shoulders in the Alaskan snow. She expected to see the man who worked 80-hour weeks on a freezing dock just to buy her whatever she desired. She expected paternal warmth and unconditional love. I looked down at her and felt absolutely nothing. The well of a father's love had completely run dry the moment I saw Patty shivering on a dog mat. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not place a comforting hand on her trembling shoulder. I simply stared at her with the cold, heavy detachment of a judge examining a condemned criminal. I told her to stop lying. My voice was quiet and perfectly flat, but it carried a lethal precision that cut straight through her hysterical sobbing. I told her I knew exactly who she was and what she had done. I reminded her of the Amber Alert. I reminded her of the locked mudroom door. I dismantled her pathetic victim narrative piece by piece. I told her a terrified hostage does not stand in a warm kitchen sipping expensive wine while her mother freezes in a utility closet. A hostage does not authorize a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation to lock her own mother in a state asylum. Melanie shook her head wildly, claiming she had no choice. She stammered about the social pressure and the country club memberships and the crushing debt Brent had hidden from her. She said she needed the lifestyle to survive in their social circle. She begged me to understand that she was just trying to keep their heads above water until the buyout went through. I stepped back, forcing her to let go of my legs. She collapsed forward onto the wet marble, her shoulders shaking. I told her I understood everything perfectly. I told her she was not paralyzed by fear of an abusive husband. She was paralyzed by the terrifying prospect of losing her imported cars and her designer clothes. I painted the exact picture of her betrayal so she could never hide from it again. I told her she stood by and watched a man wipe his dirty shoes on the very woman who gave her life. I told her she chose absolute luxury over her own mother's survival. I said she had traded her soul for a comfortable seat at a country club, and now she was going to pay the ultimate price for that transaction. The finality in my voice caused Melanie to freeze. She looked up at me, her chest heaving as the reality of her situation finally set in. She realized there was no forgiveness waiting for her here. There was no secret bank account or hidden trust fund that would catch her fall. She was entirely alone. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat. I pulled out a single crisp piece of white paper. It was not a grand leather binder or a complex corporate document. It was a simple, straightforward legal form that Wallace had expedited through the local courts earlier that morning. I let the paper slip from my fingers. It fluttered down through the quiet air and landed softly on the wet floor right next to her trembling hands. I told her it was a formal eviction notice signed and certified by a county judge. I reminded her that the Stamford estate belonged entirely to me and Patty. I stated that the fraudulent mortgage Brent had forged was currently being dissolved by federal investigators. The house was mine, and she was no longer welcome on my property. Melanie stared at this paper as if it were written in a foreign language. She gasped and tried to speak, but her throat was completely tight with panic. I did not give her a chance to formulate another lie or beg for another compromise. I laid out the exact terms of her severance with brutal, unyielding clarity. I told her she had exactly 2 hours to return to the Stamford estate. I instructed her to walk into the house and pack one single suitcase. I was very specific about what she was allowed to take. I told her she could pack basic clothing and personal toiletries. I explicitly forbade her from taking any jewelry purchased with the money Brent had stolen from my logistical accounts. I told her the expensive imported cars sitting in the driveway were collateralized assets that now belonged to my legal trust. She was not permitted to take a vehicle. She would have to call a cab or walk off the property on foot. Melanie began to hyperventilate. She reached out and clawed at the air, begging me not to throw her out on the street. She cried that she had no money of her own and nowhere else to go. She pleaded for a few days to figure things out. She asked me how a father could do this to his own daughter. I looked down at her, completely unmoved by her tears. I told her my daughter died the day she let a monster poison her mother. I stated that the woman sitting on the floor was just a parasite who had finally run out of hosts. I informed her that the locks on the estate were being changed by a private security team at exactly 12 o'clock. I promised her that if she was still on the premises at 1 minute past noon, the armed guards had strict orders to physically drag her to the curb and arrest her for criminal trespassing. I did not wait for her to process the absolute destruction of her comfortable life. I had wasted enough time in this building. I turned my back on the wreckage of my former family and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I did not look back when she screamed my name. I did not hesitate when I heard her sobbing escalate into a wretched guttural wail. I walked out of the boardroom and stepped into the elevator. As the metal doors slid shut, cutting off the sounds of her despair, I felt a profound, heavy peace settle over my chest. I pressed the button for the lobby. The toxic elements had been completely excised from our lives. Brent was sitting in a police cruiser facing decades in federal prison. Melanie was weeping on a boardroom floor, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a 2-hour countdown to homelessness. My wealth was secure, and my property was safe. I walked out of the towering glass building and stepped into the crisp morning air. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address for Stamford Memorial Hospital. I had a wife waiting for me, and we finally had the rest of our lives to rebuild in peace. I drove back to the Stamford estate under a clear midday Connecticut sky. The imposing wrought iron gates were already locked wide open. A fleet of heavy utility trucks and flatbed trailers occupied the long circular driveway. I had authorized Wallace to dispatch a premier asset liquidation firm the moment the police placed Brent in the back of a squad car. These men were not gentle residential movers. They were a highly coordinated commercial retrieval team tasked with aggressively seizing every physical item purchased with my stolen capital. I parked my car on the street and walked up the paved driveway, listening to the beautiful sound of systematic dismantling. 2 repo men were already attaching thick steel chains to the undercarriage of Brent's imported silver sports car. They worked with ruthless efficiency, dragging the heavy machine onto the slanted bed of a tow truck. The luxury vehicle that Melanie had chosen over her own mother's life was now just a confiscated piece of metal destined for a police auction block. I walked through the heavy wooden front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The space was absolute chaos. A dozen workers in matching uniforms were stripping the mansion completely bare. I watched the workers dismantle the grand dining table where Brent had hosted his arrogant dinner party just one night ago. The custom leather chairs were stacked and hauled away, leaving nothing but bare hardwood floors. They carried out oversized velvet sofas and massive crystal chandeliers. They unhooked expensive modern art from the walls, leaving behind pale rectangular shadows on the pristine white paint. Every piece of designer luxury that Brent and Melanie had accumulated over the past 2 years was being brutally marched out the front door to satisfy the immense fraudulent debt they had accrued. I walked up the grand curving staircase, listening to the heavy boots of the workers echoing through the empty halls. I found Melanie in the master suite. She was frantically shoving clothes into a single black leather suitcase. Her pristine white designer dress from the boardroom was wrinkled and ruined. Her makeup was still smeared across her face in dark, ugly streaks. She looked around the giant bedroom as the workers systematically removed the expensive mahogany dressers and the custom silk curtains. She was watching her entire universe evaporate right in front of her eyes. She moved with a desperate, frantic energy, tossing silk blouses and cashmere sweaters into the bag without folding them. The 2-hour window I had given her was rapidly closing. I stood in the doorway watching her panic. She did not look at me. She refused to meet my eyes. She zipped the overstuffed suitcase shut with shaking hands and grabbed the handle. Then she turned toward a small wooden side table that the workers had not yet claimed. Resting on top of the table was Patty's antique mahogany jewelry box. It was a beautiful handcrafted piece I had bought for my wife 30 years ago on a small island in the Pacific. It contained Patty's wedding band and the simple pearl earrings she cherished above all else. Melanie reached out and grabbed the polished wooden box. She tucked it tightly under her arm and tried to walk past me toward the hallway. I stepped forward and blocked the doorway with my body. Melanie stopped and looked up at me. Her chest was heaving, and her breath came in ragged, pathetic gasps. She told me she needed the jewelry to pawn so she could afford a hotel room for the week. She claimed she had absolutely no money for food or shelter. She begged me to let her take just this one thing. She said she was my daughter, and I could not throw her onto the street to starve. I looked at her without a single shred of paternal warmth. My expression was as cold and flat as the frozen Alaskan tundra. I reached out and wrapped my calloused fingers around the polished mahogany box. Melanie tried to pull away, but she lacked the strength to fight me. I pried the antique box from her trembling hands with slow, deliberate force. I held it safely against my chest. I told her the luxury she was trying to salvage had been bought with the stolen equity of our home and the literal poisoning of her mother. I reminded her that she had willingly traded her soul for a comfortable seat at a country club, and that she was now going to pay the ultimate price for that transaction. I told her she had watched a criminal wipe his dirty shoes on the woman who gave her life. I told her she had chosen her comfortable lifestyle over her mother's basic survival. I stated that she had forfeited the right to call herself my daughter the moment she told Patty to suffer in a freezing closet. I stepped aside and pointed down the long, empty hallway. I ordered her to walk out of my house. Melanie let out a broken, pathetic sob. She grabbed the handle of her single suitcase and dragged it down the stairs. The wheels bounced loudly against the hardwood steps. I followed closely behind her, ensuring she did not touch another single object in my home. We walked out through the empty foyer and stepped onto the front porch. The repo men were driving the last flatbed truck down the driveway, carrying away the final remnants of Brent's fraudulent empire. The beautiful manicured lawns and the expensive topiary bushes suddenly looked like a hollow stage, set now that the actors had been stripped of their costumes. Melanie stood on the edge of the stone steps, looking out at the empty driveway. She had absolutely nothing left. She had no husband, and no home, and no family. She turned around and looked at me one last time. Her eyes begged for a final moment of mercy. I simply looked right through her. I stepped backward into the foyer and pushed the heavy wooden front door closed. The heavy deadbolt engaged with a loud metallic click. I stood in the quiet, empty house holding my wife's jewelry box and left Melanie completely alone on the curb. The drive back to Stamford Memorial Hospital felt entirely different from the frantic, panicked journey I had made just 3 days ago. The sky above Connecticut was a brilliant, piercing blue, and the heavy storm clouds that had seemingly hovered over my life had completely dissipated. I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel. I listened to the steady hum of the engine and allowed the profound silence of the afternoon to wash over me. The grand estate was behind me. The liquidation crews were tearing down the false monuments of Brent's fraudulent empire piece by piece. The antique furniture and the imported sports cars and the expensive crystal chandeliers were all gone. They were nothing but ghosts now. I felt absolutely zero regret leaving that property behind. A house is just a structure of wood and stone, but a home requires safety and love. That mansion had become a freezing concrete prison, and I was finally walking away from it forever. I parked my car in this hospital lot and walked through the sliding glass doors. The bright, sterile lights of the lobby no longer felt intimidating. They felt like a guiding path. I walked past the reception desk and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the intensive recovery ward. My heavy work boots made soft thuds against the linoleum floor as I walked down the long, quiet corridor. The nurses at the central station recognized me immediately. A young nurse with kind eyes smiled at me and nodded toward the end of the hall. She told me my wife had been asking for me all morning and that her recovery was nothing short of miraculous. I thanked her and continued down the hallway, feeling a surge of pure adrenaline pump through my veins. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to Patty's room and stepped inside. The room was bathed in warm golden sunlight, pouring through the large window. The rhythmic beeping of the medical monitors was steady and calm. I stopped at the foot of the bed and felt all the remaining tension completely drain out of my shoulders. Patty was no longer the frail, shivering woman I had found trapped in the dark mudroom. The lethal synthetic sedatives were finally leaving her system. She was sitting up against a pile of crisp, white pillows. The gray, sickly pallor of her skin had been replaced by a soft, healthy pink. The dark bruising around her eyes had faded, and her cheekbones held a flush of returning life. Her silver hair was neatly brushed and resting softly against her shoulders. But the most beautiful change was in her eyes. The empty, vacant stare induced by the chemical poison was completely gone. Her eyes were bright and clear and entirely focused. She saw me standing in the doorway, and a wide, genuine smile spread across her face. I walked over to the side of the hospital bed and sat down in the plastic visitor chair. I reached out and gently took her hands in mine. Her fingers were no longer freezing cold. They were warm and steady, and they gripped my hands with a returning strength that brought tears to my eyes. I leaned forward and pressed my forehead against hers. We did not need to exchange a single word in that moment. The heavy, suffocating nightmare was finally over. We sat there in the quiet hospital room, simply breathing the same air and marveling at the fact that we had survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable. After a long moment, I pulled back and looked into her beautiful eyes. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out a thick, folded document. It was not a fraudulent power of attorney, and it was not a forged mortgage agreement. It was the official property transfer deed drawn up by Wallace and fully executed by the state courts. I unfolded the thick paper and laid it gently on her lap over the white hospital blankets. I kept my voice low and completely steady. I told her that Brent was sitting in a federal holding cell waiting for his arraignment. I told her that he was facing decades behind bars for what he did to her. I watched her expression soften with profound relief. Then I told her about Melanie. I did not sugarcoat the truth. I explained how our daughter had chosen her luxury cars and her country club status over her own mother's survival. I told Patty that I had evicted Melanie from the estate and left her standing on the curb with absolutely nothing but a single suitcase. Patty closed her eyes for a brief moment, and a single tear traced down her cheek. It was a tear of mourning for the daughter we thought we had raised, but it was quickly wiped away. She opened her eyes and nodded in silent agreement. We both knew the toxic rot had to be completely excised from our lives so we could heal. I pointed to the transfer deed resting on her lap. I told her the massive estate was being liquidated. I explained that the grand mansion with its heavy oak doors and its cold marble floors was officially gone. I told her that the proceeds from the sale would easily clear the fraudulent debts Brent had accumulated and leave us with a very comfortable nest egg. I promised her we were never going back to that house. It was a monument to greed and betrayal, and we did not need it anymore. Patty reached down and traced her warm fingers over the heavy black ink of the signature line. She looked up at me and her smile grew even wider. She did not mourn the loss of the estate. She did not care about the luxury or the prestige. She gripped my hand tightly and squeezed my fingers. I told her we could go anywhere she wanted. We could buy a small warm cabin by a quiet lake or a modest house near the ocean where the air was clean and fresh. We had our entire lives ahead of us, and we were finally completely free. The heavy chains of deception and financial abuse were permanently broken. The people who had tried to bury us were now drowning in the consequences of their own actions. I sat beside my wife, holding her warm hands in the golden afternoon light. We had walked through absolute darkness and survived the poison of our own bloodline. Now we were stepping back into the light together with nothing but the simple, honest truth to guide our way. 6 months is a very precise and specific measure of time. For a man who is actively rebuilding his entire life alongside a recovering wife, 6 months feels like a warm and fleeting breath of fresh spring air. For a man who is locked inside a sterile federal holding facility, waiting for his inevitable financial and personal ruin, 6 months feels like an absolute and crushing eternity. The federal courthouse in downtown Hartford was a massive, imposing structure built entirely of cold, polished granite and heavy dark oak paneling. It was deliberately designed by architects to make every single person who stepped inside it feel incredibly small and entirely insignificant before the weight of the law. I sat quietly in the second row of the public gallery section. The solid wooden bench was hard and unyielding against my spine. I wore a simple charcoal suit and a plain dark tie. I did not come to this courthouse today to gloat or to celebrate a victory. I simply came to sit in the quiet room and witness the final mathematical equation of justice balancing itself out. Brent sat at the heavy wooden defense table near the front of the room. He was absolutely unrecognizable. He was no longer the arrogant and wealthy corporate executive who had sneered at me across a glass boardroom table just a few months ago. The expensive, tailored Italian suits and the imported silk ties had been replaced by a shapeless, dull orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely off his rapidly diminishing frame. His thick dark hair had thinned out terribly and turned a pale, sickly gray at the temples. He sat with his narrow shoulders slumped forward, staring blankly down at his chained wrists resting on the wooden table. The judge sat high above him on the elevated mahogany bench, looking down at my former son-in-law with absolute judicial contempt. The magistrate did not waste any time with dramatic theatrics or grand moral speeches. He read the dense summary of the federal charges with a bored and mechanical precision that slowly stripped Brent of whatever remaining shreds of dignity he thought he still possessed. The judge listed the severe chemical endangerment of Patty, detailing the exact dark web purchases and the toxic sedatives. He outlined the extensive and deliberate wire fraud that Brent had used to siphon corporate funds. He detailed the cowardly forgery of medical and legal documents, including the fraudulent power of attorney. The final sentence fell upon the silent courtroom, like a heavy iron vault door slamming permanently shut. The judge explicitly sentenced my former son-in-law to a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There was absolutely no possibility of early parole. There was no leniency granted for his previous corporate status or his wealthy background. Brent collapsed forward, resting his sweaty forehead against the heavy wooden table. He let out a low, muffled sound that echoed faintly across the silent room. It was the pathetic sound of a man realizing his life was officially and completely over. He would be an old and broken man by the time he ever walked outside those high concrete prison walls again. Two heavy-set federal marshals stepped forward to escort the prisoner away. They grabbed Brent roughly by his upper arms and hauled him to his feet. As they turned him around to guide him toward the secured side exit, Brent stopped walking and looked back into the gallery. His sunken, bloodshot eyes frantically scanned the wooden benches until they finally locked onto mine. I knew exactly what he was searching for in that final pathetic moment before his incarceration. He was looking for a reaction. He desperately wanted to see a burning rage or a triumphant, vindictive smile. He needed to believe that his actions had left some kind of permanent emotional scar on my soul. He needed to feel like he still mattered to me, even as a defeated enemy. I gave him absolutely nothing. I sat perfectly still with my hands resting casually on my knees. I looked back at him with the exact same mild and hollow detachment a person might use when watching a stranger pull a car out of a grocery store parking space. There was zero anger left in my heart. There was no hatred or bitterness or joy. There was only a vast and empty indifference. Brent was no longer a threat or a monster or a rival. He was simply a canceled debt that had finally been cleared from my ledger. I watched his pale face contort in agony as the realization finally washed over him. The absolute lack of emotion in my eyes hurt him far more than any shouted insult or physical blow ever could. It confirmed his total and complete erasure from our world. He was entirely irrelevant. The federal marshals tugged hard on his restrained arms and dragged him through the heavy wooden side doors. The heavy steel latch clicked shut, sealing him away forever. The judge struck his wooden gavel and declared a brief recess to prepare the courtroom for the next case on the morning docket. The sparse crowd in the gallery slowly stood up and began to filter out into the bright marble hallway. I walked out of the dark courtroom and took a deep, long breath of the cool, conditioned air. The hallway was wide and lined with tall glass windows that looked out over the busy city streets below. I walked slowly down the corridor toward a small recessed alcove that housed a row of glowing vending machines. I felt a profound sense of closure settling deep into my bones. Patty was safely at home right now, planting a brand new garden in the backyard of our quiet coastal cottage. The long nightmare was officially buried. I heard the soft, frantic shuffling of cheap rubber soles squeaking against the polished marble floor. I turned my head and saw a woman hurrying toward me down the long, empty corridor. It took my brain a full 3 seconds to process the visual information and recognize my own daughter. Melanie looked absolutely terrible. The glamorous and arrogant socialite, who used to spend thousands of dollars on weekend spa retreats and imported champagne, was completely gone. Her custom designer clothes had been replaced by a stiff, scratchy polyester uniform from a discount retail chain. The cheap fabric was a dull, faded blue, and it hung awkwardly on her remarkably thin frame. Her normally perfect blonde hair was tied back in a messy frayed knot, and the dark bruising circles under her eyes spoke of endless consecutive sleepless nights. She looked pale and exhausted, and completely beaten down by the crushing, relentless weight of her new reality. She stopped walking a few feet away from me. She was breathing heavily and twisting her rough, unmanicured hands nervously in front of her waist. She looked up at me with red-rimmed, watery eyes. She did not call me Dad. She did not try to offer any fake, dramatic apologies or pretend that she had suddenly found her moral compass. She simply looked at me with the raw, naked desperation of a drowning and cornered animal. She began to speak in a rapid, breathless whisper. She told me she had lost the small, cramped apartment she was renting on the industrial edge of town. She explained that her retail job barely covered her basic groceries, and she was completely out of financial options. She said she had been sleeping in the dusty back inventory room of the retail store for 3 days, and the regional manager had just caught her and fired her this morning. She took a hesitant step forward and asked me for a small loan just to make the security deposit on a cheap studio apartment. She promised she would pay me back every single penny out of her next few paychecks if she could just find another job. She stood there shivering in the cold air conditioning of the federal courthouse, actively begging for a financial lifeline from the man she had previously discarded. I stood in the quiet alcove and looked at the dark grease stains on her cheap retail uniform. I looked at the desperate, frantic twitch of her thin fingers. I remembered the exact cold tone of her voice when she told her mother she was being selfish for wanting to survive. I remembered the arrogant sneer on her face when she actively planned to lock my wife in a state asylum just to maintain her precious country club membership. I remembered watching her step over her mother's dignity without a single ounce of hesitation. I reached slowly into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my leather wallet. Melanie let out a soft, ragged sigh of immense relief. Her tense shoulders dropped, and she stepped even closer, expecting me to hand over a thick stack of $100 bills to magically fix her mistakes. She thought the paternal bond would ultimately override my memory of her betrayal. I slowly opened the leather wallet and pulled out a single crisp $20 bill. I did not hold it out to her. I turned my back on my daughter and walked the remaining few steps to the glowing coffee vending machine. I deliberately inserted the crisp paper bill into the flashing mechanical slot and pressed the plastic button for a plain black coffee. The large machine hummed and whirred loudly, dropping a small cardboard cup and filling it with steaming dark liquid. The machine clicked heavily a few times and spat out $18.50 in crumpled worn bills and heavy silver coins. I reached down and picked up the hot cup of coffee with my left hand. I scooped up the meager handful of return change with my right hand. I turned back around and looked at Melanie. She was staring at me with a look of absolute sheer confusion and rapidly rising panic. She could not comprehend what was happening. I reached out toward her and dropped the crumpled bills and the handful of silver coins directly into her open, shaking palms. I looked directly into her terrified, watery eyes. My voice was calm and steady and devoid of any parental warmth. I told her she was an adult now. I told her to survive. I did not wait to see her reaction. I did not wait for the tears or the screaming or the desperate, endless bargaining. I simply turned around and walked down the long, bright marble hallway, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my hot, black coffee. The sound of her quiet, pathetic weeping echoed faintly against the cold walls behind me, but I did not break my stride or turn my head. I pushed open the heavy glass doors at the end of the corridor and stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, leaving the absolute last ghost of my past permanently behind in the shadows. The air in upstate New York tasted entirely different from the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the Stamford estate. It was crisp and clean, and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I stood on the wide wooden porch of our new home and let the morning breeze wash over my face. The cabin was modest. It was a single-story structure built of thick cedar logs with a wide wraparound deck that overlooked a massive tranquil lake. There were no imported crystal chandeliers inside. There were no custom marble floors or velvet sofas designed for arrogant dinner parties. There was only solid wood and warm light and absolute peace. We owned every single piece of timber and every square inch of the land. We had paid for it entirely in cash using a fraction of the liquidated assets from the mansion. There were no banks involved. There was no mortgage. There were no financial leeches hovering in the shadows waiting to drain our accounts. We were completely and entirely free. I held 2 steaming mugs of black coffee in my hands. The ceramic was warm against my calloused palms. I walked slowly across the wooden planks of the porch and handed one of the mugs to my wife. Patty was sitting in a sturdy rocking chair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The transformation she had undergone over the last 6 months was nothing short of miraculous. The frail, shivering shell of a woman I had found locked in that dark mudroom was completely gone. Her skin held a healthy, rosy flush. Her eyes were bright and sharp, and filled with a quiet, steady joy. The brutal synthetic sedatives had been completely flushed from her system, and her mind was entirely her own again. She took the warm mug from my hands and smiled up at me. It was the same beautiful, honest smile I had fallen in love with 4 decades ago. I sat down in the rocking chair next to hers, and we simply watched the morning mist roll slowly across the surface of the quiet lake. We did not speak for a long time. We did not need to fill the silence with idle chatter. We had earned this quiet morning through a terrible, exhausting war, and we were determined to savor every single second of it. I looked down at my hands holding the hot ceramic mug. The deep scars and permanent calluses were a map of my entire life. I thought about the decades I had spent trying to build a perfect foundation for my family. I thought about the years I had sacrificed simply to provide my daughter with a life of comfort and privilege. My mind drifted back to the grueling years I had spent working on an Alaskan oil rig. The memory of the freezing rain hit me with a sudden, vivid clarity. I remembered the punishing 18-hour shifts working out on the exposed steel deck. The wind coming off the Arctic Ocean felt like thousands of tiny, invisible blades slicing through my thick, protective gear. I remembered the heavy iron chains and the deafening roar of the drilling machinery. I remembered the bone-deep cold that settled into my joints and refused to leave even when I was huddled next to the small space heater in my cramped bunk. I endured that brutal isolation and that physical agony for one single reason. I wanted to ensure that my wife and my child would never have to know what true desperation felt like. I wanted to build a financial fortress that would protect them from the harsh realities of the world. But as I sat on the porch looking out at the calm water, I realized that my time on the freezing oil rig had taught me a much more valuable lesson. It was a lesson about absolute survival that I had ignored for far too long. When you are standing on a steel platform in the middle of a violent ocean, you learn to recognize danger immediately. If a massive chain becomes compromised or a heavy iron gear begins to rust, you do not try to save it out of sentimentality. You do not hold on to broken machinery simply because it has been with you for a long time. You recognize that a rusted link will eventually snap and drag the entire platform down into the freezing water. You learn to embrace the strategy of ruthless excision. You cut the rot away immediately to protect the structural integrity of the core. I had failed to apply that brutal logic to my own family. I had allowed the rot to spread. Melanie and Brent were not family. They were parasites hiding behind the sacred mask of kinship. They had viewed my decades of backbreaking labor as nothing more than a convenient bank account waiting to be drained. They had looked at my vulnerable wife and seen only an obstacle standing between them and their unearned inheritance. I had tolerated their arrogance and their endless greed for years because I mistakenly believed that unconditional love meant enduring their toxic behavior. I had protected the rusted links of my family chain until they finally snapped and nearly killed the only person who truly mattered to me. The quiet isolation of this cabin made everything perfectly clear. The ruthless excision I had performed 6 months ago was not an act of vengeance or cruelty. It was the necessary amputation of a diseased limb. I had cut Brent and Melanie out of our lives with the exact same cold, mechanical precision I would have used to sever a broken chain on the rig. I had stripped them of their stolen wealth and left them to face the absolute consequences of their own monstrous choices. I felt no guilt about leaving my daughter standing on the curb with a single suitcase. I felt no remorse about watching Brent being dragged away in steel handcuffs. They had chosen their path, and I had simply provided them with the final destination. Patty shifted in her rocking chair. The wooden runners creaked softly against the porch floorboards. She reached over and rested her warm hand on top of my arm. She did not ask me what I was thinking about. She already knew. We had spent the last 6 months slowly rebuilding our trust in the world and in each other. We had spent long evenings talking about the betrayal and the pain and the sheer terror of what had almost happened to her. But we had also spent our time planning this new life. We had deliberately chosen this remote location to distance ourselves from the toxic society that had poisoned our daughter. We had chosen the simplicity of the cedar cabin to remind ourselves that true wealth is not measured by imported cars or grand marble foyers. True wealth is the ability to wake up every single morning feeling completely safe in your own home. I looked at Patty and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. The dark shadows of the past were finally gone. We had survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged on the other side with our dignity and our peace completely intact. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and let the warmth spread through my chest. The sun climbed higher above the tree line, casting a bright golden light across the rippling surface of the lake. We were entirely alone, and for the first time in our lives, that isolation did not feel like a sacrifice. It felt like an absolute victory. We had successfully defended our core, and we were finally ready to live. The afternoon shadows stretched long and thin across the wooden floorboards of the cabin. The air was cooling down, bringing with it the rich, clean scent of damp earth and pine needles from the surrounding forest. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, wiping down a set of simple wooden bowls we had bought at a local market. Through the open window, I could hear the gentle lapping of the lake water against the muddy shoreline. It was a rhythmic and soothing sound that had completely replaced the constant hum of city traffic and the stressful buzzing of corporate life. Patty was resting in the next room, taking a quiet afternoon nap under a thick, handmade quilt. Our life had shrunk down to these fundamental elements of wood and water and quiet time. There were no more grand dinner parties to host. There were no more forced conversations with people who evaluated our worth by the brand of our clothing. There was only a profound and absolute stillness that we had fought incredibly hard to secure. My cell phone was resting on the kitchen counter a few feet away. It was a new phone with a brand new number. I had only given it to a handful of essential contacts like Wallace and my medical team. It began to vibrate against the smooth wooden surface. The sudden buzzing sound felt like a harsh intrusion into the sanctity of our home. I walked over and looked at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed an unknown number originating from a familiar area code. I wiped my hands on a cloth towel and swiped the green button to accept the call. I held the phone to my ear and said a simple hello. The voice on the other end of the line was frantic and breathless. It was Melanie. The sound of her weeping immediately flooded the tiny speaker. She was talking so fast that her words were blurring together into a high-pitched stream of pure panic. I did not interrupt her. I simply stood in the quiet kitchen and listened to the desperate unraveling of a woman who had finally run out of options. She told me she had somehow tracked down my new number through a former business associate. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about her mother. She immediately launched into a chaotic story about her current misery. She was crying hysterically, explaining that the cheap used car she had managed to buy a few months ago had completely broken down on the side of a busy highway. She said smoke was pouring out from under the hood, and she was stranded in the fading daylight. Her voice carried that exact same tone of entitled expectation she had used for her entire life. She was weeping, but beneath the tears there was a demanding edge. She was waiting for me to step in to my old familiar role. She expected me to feel a sudden surge of paternal panic. She expected me to demand her location call an expensive towing service and immediately wire enough funds to purchase a reliable new vehicle. She cried that she had absolutely no money to pay for a mechanic and that her retail job would fire her if she did not show up for her evening shift. She pleaded with me to rescue her. She told me she was terrified and alone on the side of the road. As I listened to her sobbing, my mind drifted away from the warm kitchen. I found myself thinking back to my younger years, standing on the frozen steel deck of an Alaskan oil rig. I remembered the relentless freezing rain that felt like shattered glass against my face. I remembered working 36-hour shifts until my muscles screamed and my hands bled inside my thick canvas gloves. I endured that brutal, punishing isolation because I believed I was building an impenetrable fortress for my family. I believed my sacrifice would buy them a life entirely free from hardship. But standing there holding the phone, I finally understood the true lesson that the freezing ocean had tried to teach me all those years ago. When a heavy iron chain on the drilling rig began to rust and weaken under the assault of the salt water, we did not try to save it. We did not hold on to the decaying metal out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. If you allowed a compromised link to remain under pressure, it would inevitably snap and drag the entire crew down into the lethal black water. You had to learn the absolute necessity of ruthless excision. You had to cut the rot away immediately and without hesitation in order to protect the integrity of the core. I had failed to apply that brutal mechanical logic to my own flesh and blood. I had allowed the rot of greed and entitlement to spread through my daughter until it completely consumed her. I had protected the rusted link for far too long, and it had nearly dragged my innocent wife down into the grave. The woman crying on the other end of the line was not my child anymore. She was just the decaying rust that I had finally found the courage to cut away. Melanie stopped talking to take a ragged breath. She waited in the silence for me to offer a solution. She waited for the familiar rescue operation to begin. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer her a stern lecture about responsibility or the consequences of her greed. I did not remind her of Brent or the forged documents or the lethal sedatives. Providing an explanation would imply that we still shared a relationship worth negotiating. I simply took a slow, deep breath of the fresh, pine-scented air. I spoke into the phone with a calm, flat, and absolute indifference. I told her she had the wrong number. I did not wait to hear her reaction. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button to end the call. I opened the settings menu and permanently blocked the unknown number, ensuring she could never reach this device again. The digital connection was severed, and the quiet peace of the cabin instantly returned. I set the phone face down on the wooden counter and walked away from it forever. I stepped out onto the wide wraparound porch just as Patty was walking out through the screen door. She had a soft wool shawl draped over her shoulders to ward off the evening chill. She looked at me with her bright, clear eyes and smiled. She did not ask who had called. She did not need to know. The past was no longer welcome in our home. I walked over and guided her toward the 2 wooden rocking chairs facing the water. We sat down together side by side. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the distant tree line, casting brilliant streaks of purple and gold across the evening sky. The colors reflected perfectly on the glassy surface of the lake, creating a breathtaking mirror of light. The cool breeze whispered through the cedar branches. I reached out and took my wife's warm hand in mine. We simply sat there, watching the day come to a beautiful natural end. The order of our world had been completely restored. The long, grueling battle was over. The silence wrapping around us was no longer heavy or filled with unspoken dread. It was finally completely peaceful. The narrative demonstrates that true wealth is found in peace and mutual respect rather than material accumulation. It highlights the difficult but necessary realization that toxic relationships must be severed even when they involve blood relatives. The story teaches us that protecting our core well-being and the people we genuinely love requires the courage to excise those who view us merely as resources. Establishing unbreakable boundaries is the only way to restore order and safeguard our dignity against endless entitlement and greed. Please share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and let us know how you would handle such a profound family betrayal.